Welcome to the Dr. Mudgil podcast. This is episode 193. We are wrapping up July here, and it has been a hot week here in New York. Got some thunder showers, but very rainy. We had some storming last night, but the rain's really coming in, like literally right now as I'm recording this podcast. Some thunder, lightning can be a little bit stormy, but that's what happens when it's hot and humid. It is summer, loving every second of it. And I'm going to dive right into the content of this podcast. So it's going to be a little bit of story time. I want to set a little bit of framework, some background framework for what this podcast is about. But just to let you know what this podcast is about, it's about never letting anyone steal your sunshine. And here goes. So, I'm talking about my family a lot because, my world is literally my family and work. And it's a beautiful world to be in. But my daughter, who's a senior in high school, applied for college this year, as seniors do. And it's for folks who are like kind of going through it now or in the last couple of years, the landscape of college admissions is like, especially since COVID, is like so different than when I was applying to college or my wife was applying to college, back in the day. Applying to college was like pretty formulaic, like these were your SAT scores, these were your grades, and like this is like the schools that you'd basically apply to. And like for me, for instance, I literally looked at the U.S. News and World Report, like top 25 list of schools, and I picked like 10 or 12 schools or whatever off of that list, and I applied. And the schools that were kind of on the bottom of that top 25 list were like my safety schools. Then I had schools at the top of the top 25 list, which were my reach schools. Then I had a bunch in the middle. And as I mentioned in the past, I got rejected from all of like the top schools, like the Harvards and Yales and those types of schools of the world. My dream school was Duke, and didn't get in there. And I was choosing between like what was left on that list. So, I don't remember exactly what the schools were, but for sure there was like University of Michigan, Emory, Washington University in St. Louis, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago. I think that was probably it. And at the time, I chose to go to Emory University in Atlanta. Great school, not knocked in at all, but it was literally one of my safety schools. Never visited, never thought in my wildest dreams I would go there, and I literally just showed up the first day of school without have ever been in Atlanta in my life, and had a great 4 years. But I'm going to come back to that. I'll get into a bit of that now. So Emory was a great school. I had a great time, great 4 years, made great friends. And it was actually the perfect school for me at the time, like looking back at it retrospectively. But the one thing I don't like about Emory and didn't like about Emory and still don't like about it is that there's nothing after Emory. Like there's no games that people get together to watch. There was no sports really at Emory. The sports we had were all like kind of low level D3 sports. We didn't have like football games or tailgate parties or any of that fun stuff that, like colleges typically, associated with. But all my buddies who went to other schools, like University of Michigan and like Stanford, and they all still get together with their buddies like now, even 30 years later, to watch games, or they meet at a bar in the city when there's a big game, and like their university will kind of like take over a bar. Like one of my daughter's friend's older brothers goes to the University of Texas, and when he was in town, he went to the city. And University of Texas bar was, some bar, all of the alumni took it over and were watching the game. And that's amazing. I feel like college is amazing, but there should be an after college where you're that very formative, important period of your life. It's something that you kind of go back to, it's a well you keep dipping into. And for me, Emory, the well dried up as soon as I graduated college. Never really thought about it. It has had no impact on my life whatsoever. And just to kind of take it back a little bit further, my big regret was not having gone to the University of Michigan, where I had a scholarship. And, I feel like I would have still had all of that, fun stuff post-college, meeting up with my buddies, watching games and that sort of stuff. So when my daughter was applying to college, and, I listen, I'm an old guy, and, I don't want my daughter to make any of the same mistakes that I did. So I said, one thing to consider when you're applying for colleges is, the after college, so it, might be a good idea to, when you're looking at schools, pick a school that has like, a thriving sports scene as well as strong academics, of course, But when you graduate from that school, you would have something that's going to like bring you back to that school, because it should be an important part of your life, for the rest of your life. And it's something that I'm jealous of my friends that have that, and it's something that I don't, which I'm, a little bit bummed about. So when we're compiling like the list of colleges, taking into account what, my daughter's, academics, she's, was a very strong student. She did like well on her board, college entrance exams. As you know, or you may not know, but, she's a competitive equestrian at a very high level, is like, won some very large national competitions. She was ranked pretty high nationally. She is my daughter, so I think she's amazing and the best, but she's, I think objectively speaking, a special person. She did great, and we expected great things, as we continue to expect great things from her. As you've heard me say many times over, the most important part of any anti-aging skin regimen is using a proper sunscreen, namely one that's at least an SPF 30 and contains titanium or zinc or both. I couldn't be more excited to announce the launch of these two amazing Dr. Mudgil brand sunscreens. One is tinted, one is non-tinted, depending on what your preference is. I also have an amazing hydrating and moisturizing serum, which your skin is absolutely going to love. There's a link in the description below, which you can click to check out the products. You are going to love them as much as I do. So that being said, in this area where we live, it's kind of a very highly competitive school district, the one that we belong to. And just this sort of area in general. And a lot of folks hire, a college like advisor type person, outside of the school to help you navigate the process. And, just like, many of our friends did, or really most of our friends did, if not all of them, we did the same. So we were interviewing this person, our college counselor. This was probably the summer before her junior year, because that's when you have to start like planning these sorts of things. And, the spectrum of these college advisors is very, very vast. There's some that are like insanely expensive, and some that are a little bit more reasonable. We kind of chose one that was, I thought it was expensive, but it's something that we knew a couple of people that used, that, their kids were kind of around the same age, a little older than my daughter. So, we interviewed this person and we hired her. And listen, to be perfectly honest, I was never a huge fan from the get-go. But, really what we needed her for was just kind of tell us what the hell needs to be done, organize a timeline, just make sure that we were getting all the things done that needed to be done, which she was very good at. But what I've come to learn, and I think a lot of my friends that I talk to that, have used college counselors, like the goal, I might be speaking out of school, all right, but this is just one man's observation that I've sort of, conferred with some other folks, and they agree with the sentiment that I have. Is the goal for a lot of these college advisors is to like, have great numbers. So like they can say, 95% of my kids got into their first choice, or, got into the school that they applied early. And a lot of like the early conversations were, like trying to get my daughter to like apply or to consider applying early decision to schools that honestly, like none of us ever even, some of them we never heard of, to be honest with you. And some of them we would have never considered. And I was like, this is very strange advice, So of course, me being me, I had my own little list I was working on the side. And of course, understanding that the climate of college admissions is very different than when I applied, it's a very different time. But I figured, hey, we got a couple of safety schools in there, some schools that we're confident that, Mira will get into. And, if that's where the story ends, it's going to be great. And, we'll, as I always say, make lemonade. And then a couple of, target schools, and then some reach schools, and, we presented this list to our college advisor, and which didn't really have like a bunch of a lot of the schools that she recommended. So in one of the meetings, she came back to us with a list, which included our schools and the schools that she was recommending. And like next to every one of the schools that we recommended was like, the University of Michigan's and the University of Virginia's and, those types of schools. She would put a little asterisk next to this list and said, parent recommended, and like, she'd have her list of schools. And she was really, very, and again, some of the schools that were on this list, I was like, listen, I'm sure it might be a wonderful school, a great school, but frankly, and I've been around the block a little bit, I have gone to various schools and met people from various schools. And, I applied to college, my wife applied to college. And quite frankly, I've never heard of some of these schools, which is odd because, I feel like I've known a lot of colleges that folks have gone to. But that being said, we obviously went with the list that my wife and I and Mira, compiled together, taking into consideration all the aforementioned factors. So at one point during this college admissions process, our outside college advisor called my wife and I, and just wanted to make sure that we were, on our own. This is a private conversation between the three of us, which I've already shared with Mira, obviously, because I tell her everything. And I also have I can't keep a secret. But she said to us, she's like, listen, I'm very, this is our college advisor talking to my wife and I, saying, she's like, listen, I'm very, very concerned with the list that Mira is applying to. These are highly rejective schools and she's just not going to get in. So I just want to make sure that, you're aware of all this, before we proceed. And I said, we're aware, and all systems go. We're going to go forward with this. Our college advisor was kind of like a Debbie Downer during the whole process, to be honest with you, which, I guess maybe she plays bad cop. That's kind of her shtick, kind of her job. But I never came away from any of these Zoom calls we would have with her, feeling, wow, this person is on our side and, rooting for us. So, and that call kind of solidified it for me. I probably would have handled it a little bit different. Say, hey, these are really, really tough schools, but you got some safety schools on there. I just want to make sure, Mira's comfortable going to these safety schools, and let's go for it. Let's see what happens. Because what was my mind, what was the point of applying to more short, shots that we're definitely going to get into? And then you have more choices of schools you kind of really didn't want to go to begin with, rather than, shoot for the stars, which is always my philosophy. So anyways, fast forward, the college admissions process is brutal. Fortunately, my daughter's a very chill person, kind of takes things in stride. And as all of the results came in, we kind of ended up in a gray zone. So Mira was actually on 7 waiting lists, 3 of which were schools that she would, be very interested in going to. And she was into a couple of other schools that she was not really super into. And, just kind of looking at where the cards were, we committed to the University of Wisconsin. And that was at the end of May, having never visited it, actually. So we had a Zoom conference with our college advisor, our outside college advisor, and said, hey, we're going to commit to University of Wisconsin-Madison. Amazing school. And I'm sure Mira would have had an amazing time there. It's, checks all the boxes. It's a high academic school with great sports. So sort of, I think it would have embodied the college experience that, I guess I vicariously envisioned for my daughter, and something that I would have enjoyed going, being part of as well. But when we talked to our college advisor about it, she was like, I think that's a great fit. It's a good school. When was the last time you guys were in Madison? And, we actually never visited Madison because we never thought that this was going to be where the story ended. So after Mira committed to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she visited, and she thought it was great. The town was beautiful. My wife and her went. I couldn't go because of work and stuff, but both of them came back. My wife thought it was great. Mira thought it was great. So we're like, okay, awesome. So if this is, where things end up, it's going to be amazing. In the back of our head, thinking that, hey, hopefully one of these waiting lists pan out. And the waiting list that, she was on, like I said, a bunch of waiting lists. But the 3 that we're kind of holding out for were University of Michigan, Cornell, and UVA. And of those 3, we thought there was 0 chance she was going to get into UVA because it's just so hard to get into. The waiting list never moves. And so we're kind of hoping, okay, so hopefully, one of these 3 pan out. UVA is probably not going to be the one that pans out. And, so Cornell and Michigan are kind of still in the mix. And, we were realistic. We know that it's very hard to come off a waiting list. The waiting list of all of these schools barely moves. I think it was a 5% chance for each of these waiting lists. Again, UVA being the hardest of them to get in off the waiting list. But we're saying, let's just wait and see what happens, because historically, looking at college admissions from my daughter's high school, folks do get it off the waiting list, and that usually happens in May. And so we said, okay, we're gonna commit to Wisconsin, but we're gonna give it to like Memorial Day to kind of see what happens. Because in this area, I don't know if this is something they do all around the country, but in these parts, like Long Island, I guess Westchester, like the suburbs of New York City, folks throw this like bed decorating party where you basically like set up like an area with all of the college swag, and it's your big announcement that this is the school I'm going to, and all your friends buy you all this swag, and like you have all this swag all over the place. And my wife loves these sorts of events and goes like ballistically out of control when she's planning these sorts of things. So internal family discussion was, okay, let's do that bed decorating party in the middle of June, just in case something pans out with one of these waiting lists, So, we waited till Memorial Day, and nothing happened. We're still waiting. And then we waited till the week after Memorial Day, and, we basically said, hey, you know what? We're all in for Wisconsin. Doesn't look like any of the waiting list stuff is going to happen. And, even though this is not what we thought the story was going to end at, this is what it is. And we're going to make lemonade. It's going to be amazing. And we're all in. So we threw the bed decorating party in Wisconsin. There's like Wisconsin swag all over my house still. I had my Wisconsin hat, shirts, sweatshirts, pajamas, jackets, sneakers. I mean, you name it. Wisconsin everywhere. And you have to go to Madison for an orientation. So Mira had that set up for, I think it was like the third week of July. And we went away the first week of July, and she was all in doing whatever she needed to do to kind of like get herself all set up to go to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And the week before she was going to go to Wisconsin, it was actually Tuesday, July 15th, we got off the UVA waiting list, which was one of my daughter's top choices. Like she was so excited. We were so excited. It was just, like I said, it's been kind of like, it was a tough year. It would have been fine. It would have been great. Wisconsin, I know, would have been amazing, but it was just so great to see that, there was good news, because it was just like months of bad news or just very sort of flat news with either rejections or waiting lists. So that was great. Now, going back to our college advisor, she didn't reach out to us one time during this whole, period where she knew we were on all these waiting lists. She knew that we committed to the University of Wisconsin, but we were sort of like cautiously waiting, optimistically waiting for some news from the waiting list. Not a peep. Didn't hear one thing. And as I mentioned, she's kind of part of Hater Nation during the entire college admissions process. So we celebrated that night, went to a great dinner, it was a great time. And I was laying down in bed and I was like, you know what? I think I just need to let this college advisor know that Mira got off the UVA waiting list, even though she said she was definitely going to get rejected and had no chance of getting in. I think the title of the email was Shoot for the Stars. And as you guys know, I started the email with, said, so-and-so, I love the quote, "Don't tell me the sky's the limit when there are footprints on the moon. I'm glad we shot for the stars. Mira's going to be a freshman at UVA next year." And that was the email. And she reached out the next day and said, it was kind of like, I guess a warmish, maybe sort of email. It was kind of like, hey, that's great. There's been like more waiting list movement, and it was kind of like saying something positive, but like taking it back. But it was what it was. I was like, whatever. I didn't really expect much from this person. It was kind of like, I felt like the tone of the email was like trying to like save face for basically assuming that Mira was going to get rejected, and she was shocked that she was on the waiting list, and that she got in off the waiting list. Was kind of trying to like a little bit of like a cover your ass type of email vibe. That's what the vibe that I got. And interestingly, when Mira got in, of course, I was like so excited for her. I was like texting everybody, like my family, my friends, everyone who knew that, the sort of the saga of the college experience. Not that it's a huge deal, like, in the scope of things in life, but, for us in our little bubble, like it was like the big thing that we were always talking about. Mira, like where Mira was going to end up at college and that sort of stuff. And, all of these like texts I got back were like, oh man, let's effing go, or this is amazing. And like everyone was just so excited. Like, all my people, all my real people, like folks that I wanted to share this good news with, all represented. They were all like, you could just feel that they were just so happy for Mira and just so happy that things turned out great. There was one text that we got from somebody. This wasn't me. This was someone on my wife's side of the texting. That was kind of like, it was sort of like this sort of like, again, this like lukewarmy type of thing. It's kind of, I think it's a person that's not always, in our camp, let's say, quote unquote. It was sort of like, well, if that makes her happy, blah, 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 when, this individual knew that we were like kind of bummed out, with the way things turned out, but we were going to make lemonade, as I always say. But, in times like this, I feel like you always sort of find out who like your ride or die, who your people are. A couple of years ago, my wife's dad passed away, my father-in-law. It's amazing. Like there was so much support and so much love we felt during that immediate period. Folks came out of the woodwork that we hadn't seen in years, and folks came to the funeral. But there was also folks that didn't show up, and we don't expect anything from anybody. It's not like, hey, we're expecting folks to do stuff, but it was just so like endearing, and just we felt so loved with the folks that did show up, that it kind of made like the folks that didn't come, who were kind of like we thought were like close to us, but that didn't like show up, and it's fine. I'm not saying there's no hard feelings, but who the real ones are, right? Who the real ones are when they come to celebrate with you. Who the real ones are when they come to cry with you. And this was sort of like an illuminating thing for us too. Like, you could kind of tell like the folks that were pumped, like are our real people, they're our ride or dies. They're on the highs with us. They're on the lows with us. And, we know who those folks are. They know who they are. And I appreciate and love each and every one of you. But again, going back to this college advisor person. So like the response we got from her was like kind of like what we expected. Like, hey, yeah, but I don't know. It's just been like, basically like, you got really lucky. I didn't think this was going to happen type of thing, and blah, 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 blah. So that was it. I was kind of done with her anyways. But this week, oddly enough, she kind of like just reached back out, and knowing that like we, committed to UVA, we're all in with the swag. And, we basically declined the offer to the University of Wisconsin, and we were all in. We're going to the University of Virginia. My daughter's going there, but as a family, we're all part of it. And she sends us an email saying, hey, like, I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's been a lot of turmoil at UVA, and, there's been a lot more movement from the waiting list, like based on whatever her data is. I don't know. She doesn't have any hard data. I'm sure of that. But, we were all well aware of this. Like, back in June, like every elite institution is on the hook. The Trump administration is scrutinizing government funds that are going to schools. It's happening at Harvard, it's happening at Columbia, it's happening at Cornell, and it's happening at UVA, where there's all these sort of like, negotiations that are taking place. And the president of UVA stepped down in June. It was a big article in the New York Times, which we were aware of. Like I read that in real time back in June. Because it's happening everywhere. And, she was basically like referencing that article, which we already knew about. And that was before we thought Mira was even going to go to UVA, and it had like really no bearing on, our decision to go there. But she kind of sent an email this week, basically raining on our parade or trying to steal our sunshine. That was like the vibe of the email. And it just had me thinking about, what I mentioned at the very onset of this podcast. I know it's been long and a rambling one, but you can't let folks steal your sunshine. Everyone has their own motives. Everyone has their reasons. Haters are going to hate. Players are going to play. I say it all the time. And you just got to, in my gut feeling, and I could be totally off base with this person, but I'm usually a pretty good judge of character and kind of can, peg people for who they are. And, my sense is we basically didn't listen to any of her advice, except for like the timeline that she put us on, which was very helpful. Thank you for doing that, if you are actually listening to this podcast. But everything else was just like, it was just such a sort of a negative process for us. She was never encouraging. She really had no idea who my daughter was. She got paid handsomely for whatever she did. And, getting us on the timeline and getting us to the checkpoints and with all the things that needed to be done on a logistics level, she was very helpful with that. But in terms of like, morale and like, advice, it was terrible. And I'm glad we stuck to our guns. I'm glad that we shot for the stars, which everybody should do, because that's what it's all about. You got to take your chances. You got to shoot your shot. And I'm glad we did. And no matter, what may be said, folks trying to steal our sunshine, rain on our parade, that sort of thing, it's just not going to happen, because these sunbeams are shining so bright that, they cannot be extinguished. And that's a lesson to be learned, I think, for me, for all of us. There's you gotta, like I say, you gotta audit your circle. You also have to filter what penetrates your mind. And there's your ride or dies, the folks that you really trust, folks whose opinion you really trust, folks who you count on, folks who count on you. Those are the opinions, and and even sometimes those opinions don't really matter. What matters is what you think, what you feel in your heart, with the folks who really, really, really love you, the advice they give you, and the advice that you are seeking and respect. That's what counts. Don't let anyone steal your sunshine. Haters gonna hate, players gonna play. That's just the way this world works. And that's all I gotta say. Sorry if that was too long of a podcast, but I had a lot to say. And I hope you all have a wonderful, restful weekend, or just ready to crush the week ahead. Shine bright. Let's get it.